Alright children, it's me, your favorite teacher, Mr. Fritz. Welcome back. Today we're going to be learning about the Phillips curve. Alright, so the Phillips curve, particularly the short-run Phillips curve, is going to show us the relationship or the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the short run, the relationship between unemployment and inflation is inverse. As inflation decreases, our unemployment rate goes up. And as our unemployment rate decreases, our inflation goes up. And that's essentially how it is. So let's say like aggregate demand decreases. We fall into a recession. Let's say we're right here. Aggregate demand is decreased and we fall into a recession. Our unemployment rate is going to increase, but our price level is going to be coming down. If we go into a demand pool inflation situation and aggregate demand is increased, we're going to end up with our unemployment rate decreasing, but our inflation rate going up. And so because of that, if aggregate demand is shifting, what we're seeing is a movement along this short-run Phillips curve. And that's what the SRPC stands for, short-run Phillips curve. As aggregate demand changes, we see a movement along this curve. So that's what's happening here. So again, to reiterate, when we're in a recession, our unemployment rate is going to be higher, so our dot would be somewhere over here. We'd end up over here with a higher unemployment rate, but a lower inflation rate. But as we go into an inflationary gap, well then obviously inflation is going to increase and our unemployment rate is going to decrease. Alright, we also have the long-run Phillips curve. Your long-run Phillips curve is going to be a lot like your long-run aggregate supply curve because what it's showing is the same relationship. In the long run, no matter how high our inflation gets, no matter how high prices get, we can get back to full employment output. So we can get to our natural rate of unemployment. This long-run Phillips curve represents our natural rate of unemployment. For us in the United States, it's going to be somewhere about 5%. So no matter how high prices get, we can keep operating at full employment because wages will adjust to that. And so in the long run, as price level goes up, wages go up too, and we can always operate at full employment output. So again, this represents our natural unemployment rate, and it's very closely related to our long-run aggregate supply curve, the same idea. Now, where this intersects is our short-run Phillips curve and our long-run Phillips curve. This is going to be our inflation rate. So let's say this is like a 5% unemployment rate. We'll call this 2% inflation rate. This curve represents our expected inflation rate. So this is our expected inflation rate right now. We expect 2% inflation. So this would show us operating at full employment output. We have a 2% inflation rate and we have 5% unemployment. We're at full employment output. Long-run aggregate supply and short-run equilibrium are matched up right in the middle. Now, if we enter a recession and aggregate demand decreases, let's say our net exports are falling, people in other countries aren't buying stuff from us anymore. Aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. That's going to lead to a higher unemployment rate and a lower price level. So our dot will just move along the curve. Remember, a shift in aggregate demand is going to cause a movement along the short-run Phillips curve. So what we'd end up with here is a higher unemployment rate and a lower inflation rate. Let's call it 1% inflation. Let's call this, 7% unemployment. So we're ending up with a higher unemployment rate, lower inflation rate. So this 2% is our expected inflation. Currently, we are experiencing unexpected disinflation. Prices didn't rise by as much as we thought they would because of an increase in the unemployment rate, because of a decrease in aggregate demand. And so people that are on fixed income, they're going to be better off. But people that borrow money are going to be worse off because now they're paying back a higher real interest rate. All right, now what happens if the opposite is true? What if we go into an inflationary gap? So again, let's just say that that now our net exports are increasing. People in Japan all of a sudden want to buy a lot of stuff from the US. Aggregate demand increases and shifts to the right. We end up with a higher price level and a lower unemployment rate. Again, aggregate demand shifted, so it's going to cause a change, a movement along this curve. So, aggregate demand increased. That made our price level increase. So inflation is increasing and our unemployment rate is decreasing. So now our dot's moving somewhere over here. So now this is a 3% inflation rate and we have a higher than expected inflation rate. And let's say, 4% unemployment rate. So our unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment. Our price level our inflation rate is higher than we expected. And so people that are on a fixed interest loan are now going to be better off. people that are living with fixed income, people that are on Social Security or living off their retirement benefits. They are now worse off because things cost more than was expected. So remember, a shift in aggregate demand is going to cause a movement along the short-run Phillips curve. Now we're going to look at what happens if short-run aggregate supply changes. All right, now we're going to talk about what happens if we have a shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. We already talked about aggregate demand. Now we need to look at what happens with aggregate supply. So let's say that we have a decrease or negative supply shock. Short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left. So maybe the price of oil has increased, and oil goes into the production of everything. We are experiencing an increase in the price level, cost-push inflation, and an increase in the unemployment rate. Both price level and unemployment are going up at the same time. So what are we going to do here? If I increase our unemployment rate, then our inflation rate is going to come down. If I increase inflation, the unemployment rate is going to come down. So we can't just move along this curve. We actually have to create a whole new curve and shift this thing to the right. So now we end up with a new short-run Phillips curve, and both our inflation and unemployment have both increased at the same time. This can also happen the other way. I'll show you what else could happen. All right, so now let's say that we're starting off in a recession. That means our unemployment rate is high and our inflation rate is low. So we're just going to say we're starting off right here. A, we're in a recession. High unemployment, low inflation. Now, what if the government takes a laissez-faire, hands-off approach and they say, we're just going to sit back and let this gap close itself? Well, over time, eventually, as people are out of work longer, they'll begin to accept lower paying jobs, wages will decrease, people will get hired back, and short-run aggregate supply will shift back to the right. As short-run aggregate supply shifts back to the right due to a decrease in wages, let me draw it, we end up with a lower price level, and our real GDP increases, which means our unemployment rate is going down too. So we have price level and unemployment decreasing at the same time. In order to show this, we need to have this whole curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, has to shift to the left. As it shifts to the left, you end up back at full employment output, and both your unemployment rate has decreased and your price level has decreased. So inflation and unemployment go down at the same time. Things to remember, if aggregate demand shifts, you're going to have a movement along the curve. If short-run aggregate supply shifts, you're going to have the whole curve shift. Let's do a couple practice real quick. All right, we're going to assume an economy is in the midst of an inflationary gap. That means that aggregate demand has increased. We have high prices but low unemployment. If we have high prices but low unemployment, then we're going to have to be somewhere over here. Our prices are higher than our unemployment is. So this is where we're going to begin. This is our first dot. We're starting in an inflationary gap. Prices are too high. So let's say the Fed decides that they're going to try to get out of this by decreasing the money supply and shifting the money supply curve to the left, causing the nominal interest rate to go up, which will cause people like you and me to spend less money. So they increase the reserve requirement ratio. It's harder to take out loans. People stop spending. Eventually, aggregate demand will decrease and shift to the left. As that happens, our price level is going to decrease, as is our price level is going to decrease. Inflation rate comes down, and our unemployment rate is going to increase some as we get back to full employment output. All right, let's work on these.